Hey, good morning everybody, and welcome to April 2nd's lecture for USU 1300. I am again Peter Crosby. I'm going it alone today. My daughter decided that since she's on spring break, she would rather go downstairs and watch cartoons. And quite frankly, I can't really blame her for that. So today we're going to talk a little bit about demographics in the United States and how the shape of the population can potentially impact existing and future elections, both at the presidential level, and then also maybe at some of these other national campaigns as well as we look at Congress. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through some of the data sets that we have from the 2016 presidential elections. We're going to look at some of the data from the 2018 House elections, it's the most recent national election data set that we have. And then we'll talk a little bit about demographic trends in the United States. And kind of see maybe where we're headed as a country. The big question, though, before we start all of this is, do demographics matter? And I really hope that by the end of today's lecture we have some solid answers to that particular question. There's a quote that's kind of anonymous. Nobody really knows where it came from, although it's often misattributed, that says demographics are destiny. And to some extent that is true. So if we understand the makeup of a population, if we understand some basic details about who they are, we have the ability to really pinpoint maybe some of their policy preferences and to predict the kinds of decisions that they're going to make. This is why big data in 2020 is so powerful. If I can understand your race, your sex, your age, your education level, your religious affiliation, where you live, even with just 5 or 6 basic data points, I start to have a pretty good understanding of probably your policy preferences on a lot of really important issues. And when you start to add in big data points like how often you use your cell phone, what websites you go to, what you purchase, whether you go to Walmart or whether you go to a local grocery store, when you're going out grocery shopping, how you spend your time on the internet, what news source you go to, like when you start to add in all of that information, you get really, really good at being able to predict perhaps the outcomes of certain kinds of decisions. Now, demographics are not destiny in the fact that just because you're a middle-aged white man or a 20-year-old black woman, or a gay Asian living in San Francisco, it doesn't guarantee that I'm going to know exactly what kind of decision you're going to make in any given circumstance. But when you get enough people that are like that together, you start to understand how the group itself is going to move. And so that's why people often say that demographics are destiny. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and first take a look at the 2016 election results between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And then, like I said, we'll move to 2018 and we'll kind of go from there. If you guys have any questions as we move throughout this, go ahead and toss them up in chat, and we will go ahead and do our best to respond to them. And by we, I guess I mean I. So as we're looking at the 2016-2018 exit polls, this is data that we're pulling from the New York Times. New York Times is a publication that tends to lean left, but the quality of its reporting is very high. And we've talked about that in class before, as far as how to check the bias behind your media sources. So as we look at this, we have some really useful initial information. Right now we have sex, race, age, education, and then we started to get into things like education by race, etc. What we're looking at is the demographic split of a population and who voted for who. So when I look at the first bar of sex, I notice that 53% of males voted for Donald Trump and 41% of males voted for Hillary Clinton. And then 54% of females voted for Hillary Clinton and 42% of females voted for Donald Trump. So right here, taking a look at this, I get a pretty good indication that there was a gender dynamic that was at play in the 2016 election. Men favored Donald Trump, women favored Hillary Clinton. Okay. As I look down through kind of the racial breakout, I noticed that whites definitely preferred Donald Trump, so it's 58% of the population, while blacks definitely preferred Hillary Clinton. It was 88% of blacks who voted decided to vote for Hillary Clinton. And then when you look at the other minority populations, they also had a strong preference for Hillary Clinton as the Democratic nominee. When we go to the age breakout, you'll notice that younger voters tended to break towards the Democratic nominee, which is Clinton, and older voters tended to break for Donald Trump or the Republican nominee. And then as we scroll down through education and then education by race and income, we notice that these kind of trends start to persist in other areas as well. So more educated individuals tended to break for the Democratic nominee. We mean that by people that had acquired a college degree or post-college degree, while those with a high school or less education or some college tended to break for the Republican nominee. As we look at education by race, we notice that really the strongest kinds of break here in support is that non-educated whites, non-educated whites really broke strongly for Donald Trump, while educated non-whites and non-educated non-whites also really broke strongly for Hillary Clinton. And so there does seem to be maybe a little bit more understanding of who exactly these voters are based off of race and based off of education level. And then when you look at overall income levels, you start to see that those who had less income tended to break for the Democrats, while those who had more income tended to break for the Republican Party. And again, this data is 4 years old, and it's really interesting how this has kind of shifted in the last couple of years, but we'll get to that in a minute. And then this kind of goes down on into some other things as well. We're not going to go through each of these line by line for the rest of them, although if you would like, I can certainly send you guys out the links because I think this information is very interesting. And the good thing about the New York Times is they actually have breakouts for all of the past presidential elections going pretty far back. The reason that we're looking at this is because it helps indicate that there does seem to be some population grouping preferences towards political ideology. And when we recognize and acknowledge that women, at least in 2016, tended to vote more Democrat than men did, when minorities tend to vote more Democrat than Republican, when whites tend to vote more Republican than Democrat, the age range, the education level, the income level, the religiosity of particular groups, we start to find perhaps that there is the ability to predict what's going to happen in future elections based off of existing demographic trends. Meaning, if we have a population that becomes more white, we would anticipate, based off of our data, that we would have a population that elects more Republican presidents. If we have a population that becomes more female, then we would anticipate perhaps that we'll have a population that elects more Democratic presidents. If we have a population that tends to be younger as an overall population set, then we would anticipate perhaps that population might be more inclined towards Democratic than Republican nominees. And so again, by understanding the preferences of these groups as a whole, we can start to perhaps anticipate what future decisions look like. And this can be really, really interesting and really, really valuable. Because when you can start to predict how populations are going to move, and when you can start to predict the kinds of decisions populations are going to make, you can anticipate them and you can plan for them. And if you're a political party, then you can perhaps say, well, who do we need to focus on the most in order to maximize our chances to get elected, to get power in a democratic system. So one other thing that I do want to show you from the 2016 breakout is kind of more interactive. And this one comes from the Washington Post. And I like this one because I think it gives us the opportunity to kind of noodle with this data a little bit more. And so we could say, let's take a look at black women with a college degree. If the population of the United States was was largely constituted of black women with college educations, Hillary Clinton would have won in a landslide. No questions asked. 92% of college-educated black women voted for Hillary Clinton. If we look at black men with a college degree, the split is not as significant, but it's still pretty overwhelmingly in favor of the Democratic nominee in a particular case. And so from these two data points, we could suggest that educated blacks really do prefer Democratic nominees. If we look at non-educated blacks, it's the same situation. Even by a more significant margin here for non-educated black women. And when I say non-educated, in all references, I'm referring to whether or not they have a college degree. Now, if we change this to say white women, non-educated white women really preferred Donald Trump. 61 to 34, I mean, that's a pretty significant split, right? So it's 2/3 of that population. Non-educated white men, 71% of them. So there was a really strong preference among non-educated white men to vote for Donald Trump in 2016. When you add education in, this split becomes far less significant. And I think this is really interesting to think about. So there's definitely a preference here for white men to vote for Donald Trump in 2016. College-educated white women, however, broke for Hillary Clinton. And again, when you looked at the black population, or we can even just look at the non-white population, so we're not looking at one particular racial group. When you look at the non-white population of men and women, whether they have college educations or not, they always break left. So that's their preference right there, is they break left. When you look at educated populations among the white population, non-educated whites broke for Donald Trump, and educated whites were divided based off of gender preference, based off of sex. So educated white men broke for Donald Trump, but educated white women broke for Hillary Clinton. The reason that I bring this up is it suggests that there's different aspects of our identity, perhaps, that are going to strongly influence our political preferences. And again, if you can identify what those influencing factors are, and you can figure out where they are in your population, and if they're growing or shrinking, it gives you some real power to understand what potentially might happen in the future. Now, I think at this point, there's a pretty obvious question to ask, which is why? Right, so why did non-educated and educated minorities break for the Democrats? Why did non-educated white men and educated white men break for Donald Trump? And non-educated women break for Donald Trump, but educated white women broke for Hillary Clinton? I don't know that there's a perfect answer for this question based off of the 2016 results. There's quite a few theories out there, and I think some of them are certainly valid. Some of them I think are well researched. But I think the main takeaway is that in 2016, Donald Trump was able to inspire a certain segment of the population to participate actively in the democratic process. He talked to them about the fact that the system was not working for them. And his solutions to those problems resonated with that particular voter segment more powerfully than Hillary Clinton, quite frankly. And so he was able to stand up in front of them and say, hey, the system has screwed you guys over. It's not working for you. I know how this system works because I've been abusing it for years. He was pretty candid about that. And I'm going to make sure it starts working for you. And he, didn't care about being politically correct in his speech. He just shot from the hip and told it how it was. And that kind of persona and the message that he had was really appealing to that particular segment of voters. He seemed like somebody that would represent them in the national stage, and that inspired them to come out and participate more actively in democracy. And so he won. He won in 2016. He did not win the popular vote. So Hillary Clinton actually won more votes than Donald Trump did, just based off of head count. But Donald Trump won more votes in the states that swung the election based off of the Electoral College system, which we've talked about in the last couple of days. And so this mattered. Donald Trump's team understood who his message would appeal to, the kinds of people or the demographic characteristics of the group that would be most likely to be receptive to his messaging, and so he focused his efforts on them. One of the criticisms that Hillary Clinton gets from 2016 is that she did not inspire part of her voter base to come and turn out as effectively as Barack Obama did. So specifically, black voters didn't love Hillary. While most black voters voted for her, they saw fewer black voters in general in 2016 than you saw in 2008 or 2012. And so while still most black voters preferred a Democratic nominee, there were just fewer black voters in general that turned out, especially in those states that were really important. And so this ended up being one of the factors that lost her the election. And the other thing is that her message of I'm going to make the system work for you just didn't resonate with people that broke for Trump. It didn't resonate with the non-college educated whites the way that Trump's message resonated with them. So that's 2016. The other reason that we're using 2016 is because it's a really good kind of baseline for the last 4 years. It's a presidential election. We've got lots of data. It's a national election. We have lots of people participating. And so it gives us a good snapshot of what the country kind of thought back in 2016. The next thing that I kind of want to focus on then is maybe the evolution since 2016. And this is 2018. And so 2018 was our last major election that influenced the legislative body, which is Congress. So again, members of the House go up for election every 2 years. Members of the Senate go up every 6 years. The president's every 4 years. 2018 is what we call a midterm election. So it's halfway between presidential elections. And so there were a lot of representatives in the House that were up. And it's really interesting to see how this particular election saw demographic shifts from just even 2 years prior. The big thing here that I want to point out, which the CNN one and the Washington Post one doesn't necessarily do very well, which is what percentage of the overall population each of these demographic categories made up. So as we look at gender, for example, 52% of voters in 2018 were female, and 48% of voters were male. And when we look at their preferences, there was a strong preference in female voters for Democratic nominees. So female voters were the largest percent of the voting population, and they strongly preferred Democratic nominees. Just looking at this one data point would suggest that Democrats probably did very well in 2018, and they did. Looking at the age breakout, you'll notice that there's a pretty strong preference among younger voters for Democrats back in 2018. So when you look at the kind of the age ranges, here's some general categorizations. This one breaks it out more, but we're actually going to focus on just this 18 to 44 and 45 and older. This breakout is pretty clear cut. So voters that fall within the Gen X range and the millennial range, because again, this was a couple of years ago, strongly preferred Democratic nominees. Voters that were older than that, so we would call them baby boomers or the silent generation, so those two generations together, those ones had a very, very slight preference for Republican nominees, this 49-50%. And so even though 45 and older were the majority by far of people that actively participated in the voting process, because that preference was pretty evenly split between both parties, it was these younger voters between 18 and 44 that really pushed this election towards Democrats. As we come down here to a racial breakout, again, we saw this back in 2016, right? So whites had a preference for Republican nominees, non-whites had a preference for Democratic nominees, and this persisted in 2018. So non-white voters really, by a pretty strong margin here, preferred a Democratic nominee. White voters did prefer Republicans, but again, that margin is not nearly as significant as the margin that's right here for non-white voters. White voters were still a pretty significant majority of the voting population in 2018. They accounted for 72% of the people that participated, which means that white voters' voices definitely had a stronger impact on the overall election results. But when you take 44% of the white voters and combine it with the 76% of the non-white voters, again, it's not hard to see how Democrats were pushed into more success than perhaps they had initially anticipated. When you look at the actual racial breakout, you'll notice that the support for Democrats is strongest among the Black community. And then you have a preference among the Latino community, and again, a pretty strong preference here among the Asian community. This Latino community is really, really important, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes. But it's important, I think, to note that, again, it's 11% of the overall population as far as who's participating in voting. And while they prefer Democrats, it's not nearly as strong, perhaps, as some of the other minority groups in the United States. Okay, so we do have a question. Becky popped in, and why do you think the swing from 2016 to 2018 occurred? We'll talk about, I guess, the general swing, or are you referring to a specific swing among a specific demographic group? Because from a general perspective, the answer is Donald Trump. Okay, and there's really no long or short to it. The early, the entire Trump administration, it's been 3 years. Um, it's been a really interesting one, like just candidly speaking. So it's been a very interesting experience from a political science standpoint because it has been so atypical from other kinds of presidential administrations in recent American history. And the first 2 years really, I think, became sort of a rallying cry for a lot of people as they saw the Trump administration divert from what we would consider normal presidential activities in both his behavior and some of the policy preferences and other things that were coming out. And so a lot of the success that happened in 2018 came from two main factors. One, the Trump administration pushed this idea that was favorable among most Republicans, which is that Obamacare was a mistake and that we should get rid of the health care plan. And that was a mistake because most Americans actually decided that Obamacare, while imperfect, was better than not Obamacare when you look at the polling numbers. And so healthcare, and we'll look at this actually in a little in just a minute down here, healthcare was actually one of the most important considerations that people had when they voted in 2018. And the Democrats turned the 2018 election into basically the Republicans want to get rid of your healthcare. And that message really resonated with a lot of folks. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we seem to have been able to identify is that Democrats ran a lot of moderate candidates, so they weren't far left on the progressive scale. And those moderate candidates said, listen, I'm not somebody who's going to enable Donald Trump's worst impulses. And that message seemed to resonate pretty strongly with a lot of voters as well, which is this idea that when you have a two-party system, the purpose of those two parties is to balance each other out, right? So if we have a Democrat in the White House, then we would expect the Republican Party to help kind of act as a counterweight against them. When we have a Republican in office, we would expect the Democrat to act as a counterweight against them. And the Republicans completely controlled the White House, the House of Representatives, and the Senate before the 2018 elections, which means the Republican Party got to do whatever it wanted from a legislative standpoint for the most part. And a lot of voters reacted not as positively to that control, perhaps, as Republicans had expected. And there was a backlash. Now, does that mean it because everybody hates Republicans? Not necessarily. There tends to be pushback against the party in power by Americans because we like chaotic systems, apparently. So I think those are the main factors, though, which is Democrats highlighted a specific policy issue, a Republican desire to get rid of Obamacare that a lot of people actually liked, and Democrats ran nominees that were more moderate that specifically campaigned on, I'm going to check Donald Trump, and that message seemed to resonate with a lot of voters. That's a really good question. All right, so looking again down here, we're going to skip some of these breakouts, although I do kind of want to focus on this age by race. So as we look at age by race, this again is the 2018. There's only two age by race groups that solidly broke Republican, and that's whites who were 45 and older. So whites between 45 and 64, and whites between 65, whites older than 65 years old. The rest of the population broke Democrat in 2018. This means that whether you were white or non-white, if you were under the age of 45, you basically looked at what was going on and made a decision that I think I'm going to go Democrat, which is really interesting. Like, that's a pretty significant population shift here to have happen. And when you look at, I don't think this one does it, but when you look at sex, does this one do sex? No. But when you look at sex as well, basically what we have in 2018 is we have middle-aged and older white men voting Republican and everybody else breaking Democrat. Not that there weren't people who didn't vote Republican or Democrat among the rest of the demographic groups. We're just talking about how the group as a whole moved. And the only groups that consistently moved towards Republicans were middle-aged and older white men. Everybody else moved Democrat. And when you look at demographic trends, which is what we're going to do in a few minutes, That's a big problem for the Republican Party. That's a really big problem for the Republican Party, actually. If they don't do a better job of appealing to a broader set of voters, they're going to have some real issues when it comes to winning elections. Okay, so education levels again. Typically, the more education you have, the more likely it is that you're going to vote for a Democrat. Even, you know, again, when we look at the white population, that does seem to be a little bit different. But generally speaking, the more education that you have, the more likely it is that you're going to break for Democrats. As we look at income levels, this one I thought was pretty interesting as well, which is right here. So the median income in the United States is about $54,000 a year. It kind of goes up or down depending on how the economy is doing, but it hovers around $54,000 a year. And when you look at the voting population, the percentage of the population that makes more, that makes at least that or more, is not necessarily the vast majority of the population. And when you look at people who would consider really successful, 67% of the population is making less than $100,000 a year. Okay, 33% of the population is making $100,000 or more a year, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the econ stuff. But of that general population, it's pretty striking to note that people making less than $100,000 a year, which again constitutes 2/3 of the population, they broke Democrat, and they broke Democrat, not by 1 percentage point. There was a strong preference for Democrats in the 2018 midterms. All right, so we have another question. So moving forward, can we expect the Republican Party to change their policy platform in order to get more voters? Carolyn, that is a great question. The answer is I don't know, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And we can do it right now. I mean, there's no need not to. So Republicans actually became aware of some serious demographic concerns, at least as far back as 2008. So this is when Barack Obama was elected to the White House for the first time. And they identified that they needed to expand their voter base if they were going to go ahead and have long-term success as a party. There's basically two kind of ideas here. You can either appeal to more voters in general, or you can get the people that like you more passionate. And so even though they're a smaller segment of the population, because we don't have required voting in the United States, you can make it more likely that they'll go out and participate. And so the Republicans, at least as far back as 2008, identified that, hey, we don't resonate well with minorities, specifically Latinos, which is really interesting because there's a lot of conservative values that Latino populations actually think are good. So conservatives are typically identified as kind of a family-first sort of policy preference. They have a belief in things like traditional marriage. They're not huge fans of legalized drug usage. They're social conservatives, right? And when you look at Latino culture, a lot of those social conservative values actually tend to mesh pretty well. And Republicans knew this, right? And so in 2012, they ran a couple of nominees for president and vice president they thought was actually a pretty strong ticket. This was Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. And they got their butts kicked. Like they did. They got their butts kicked. Barack Obama won the 2012 election. And it was an election that maybe he shouldn't have won if the Republicans had done a better job of understanding how to bring in a broader voter base, because Republicans had a message that could resonate very well with certain aspects of the population, specifically this Latino community, but they have one message that absolutely does not resonate, and that's their policy on immigration. And so after the 2012 election, the Republican Party did this huge postmortem. And they got together and they basically said, here's where we went wrong, and here's what we need to do differently if we're going to be successful in the long term. And part of that was better engagement and reach out to Latinos. And so there was serious consideration or talk among conservative think tanks about, well, how do we handle this immigration concern? A lot of pro-business Republicans are actually, they're good with immigration. They're like, yeah, they help the economy, because when you look at the numbers, immigrants, whether they're legal or illegal or legal. They actually are an economic net gain for the United States. And so they're like, yeah, this shouldn't be necessarily a problem. I'm sure we can come up with something. We can work with Barack Obama on this whole Dreamer situation. We can find a permanent solution here. And that would probably buy us a lot of goodwill with Latinos. And then in 2016, Donald Trump became the presidential nominee for the Republican Party. And he won in part by motivating people to vote who really, really, really don't like immigration and who really, really don't feel comfortable with minorities in the United States, minorities as non-whites. And so Donald Trump's policy preferences have been remarkably anti-minority from that perspective. His rhetoric around immigration, his rhetoric around programs that minorities are interested in is not something that induces minorities to actively say, yeah, I should vote for a Republican. And that has some potentially long-term policy consequences and political consequences for Republicans, because the population, as we'll look at in a bit, it's only getting more diverse, and the Latinos are only growing as part of an overall percentage of the U.S. population. And so to actively shun that community and push them away, that's problematic. Like, it's going to cause some problems for them. All right, so we have a couple other questions in here. Do you think since education among our population is rising, we can expect more people to vote among Democratic Party lines? So I think this is an interesting question. There's a good quote that I really like from Winston Churchill. It refers to socialism. He says, if you are young and you don't vote for a socialist, you don't have a heart. If you're old and you vote for a socialist, you don't have a brain. And the reason that I bring that up is age is really a pretty significant impactor on political preferences, even more so than education. Because as people age, they have traditionally become more stable and more successful. And as they have become more stable and more successful, at least in the United States, they have become less inclined to pay additional taxation to support social programs. Because their thinking is, well, the system that existed was fine for me and I was able to be successful, and so why do I need to pay more taxes to help somebody else out? They can just do the same things that I did. And so even though the population might get more educated, I don't know that it's going to directly translate into a more democratically, like from a party standpoint, inclined population, because if people age and they do gain material wealth and they do gain financial stability, they might not necessarily be inclined to vote for a party that decides that taxation to support social services is in their best interest. So I don't know if education is going to necessarily predict the rise of the Democratic Party. Okay, a couple last questions and we'll keep going. So it seems like in 2016 the Republican Party moved more to the right. Yeah, they absolutely did. So why did they do this when in the future they need to move left in order to do better with minorities? Well, it's a really good question. This is the difference between tactical planning and strategic planning. So tactical planning is looking at your immediate situation and saying, how do I win this fight? Strategic planning is looking at the entire battlefield and the next battlefield and the battlefield after that and saying, how do I win this war? Something that people sometimes look to is the American Civil War. So at the start of the U.S. Civil War, the South had better generals. Okay, Robert E. Lee was a pretty successful general, although he made some stupid mistakes too. Jackson, good, Stonewall Jackson, fantastic general. They had better leadership than the North did. And they won some initial battles. But the North had an entire industrial complex capable of just beating the snot out of the South year after year after year. The North could absorb some of those tactical losses and still win because their overall strategy was better, because they had more resources, they had more ability to win the long fight. And so the South knew this, and they were going to try and take out Washington, D.C. early in the war and try and force a resolution, and they failed at that, and so the North eventually won. And so in 2016, Donald Trump made tactical decisions, right? He made decisions to go ahead and win the immediate election. And the Republican Party didn't want to lose the 2016 election, so they made tactical decisions too. And there's this thinking that voters are dumb and voters don't have long memories, which unfortunately does have some truth to it, that the Republicans could say something today and then say something different tomorrow, and everybody would be fine with that. And so they thought tactically, how are we winning in 2016? The question is whether or not those tactical decisions are going to have long-term strategic consequences. The answer to that, Nick, is I don't know yet. And I don't. And maybe it will, maybe it won't. Oh man, we have, good, this is good. We have a bunch of questions that are pop in here. So I'm going to let this chat sit for a minute or two while I go back to this. Because we only have like 15 minutes left. So I just want to, one last thought on this demographic standpoint is that demographics do seem to matter, okay? Who we are and kind of our background and our access to resources, whether it's income or education or religious affiliation, that does seem to have some sort of influence on how we make political decisions in the United States. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about what the United States is going to look like. So this comes from Pew Research, which is fantastic. And this first dynamic that we're looking at here on the screen is a pyramid, right? That shows how America's population is aging over time. And what you'll notice is that the pyramid stops looking like a pyramid and starts looking more like a rectangle. And this is pretty impactful for a variety of reasons. What this means is that in general, the US population is going to have an average age that increases. The reason for this is at least twofold. One, we live longer. So people have better medical care in general and they live longer. Okay, so grandma doesn't die at 70, grandma dies at 92 or 105. The other thing is that we don't have as many kids right now. Which means that our population doesn't have, again, if we go back to kind of this pyramid perspective, here in 1950 we have this ton of kids, right? This is the baby boomers as they're moving up the ranks. And then those kids, they grow older, but they didn't have kids themselves, or not nearly as many children. And so the population as a whole takes this more rectangular shape. This is what aging societies like Italy and Japan look like, and they have some pretty serious concerns about how to sustain themselves over the long term. One of the net positives of immigration, guys, is that immigration actually gives the United States a positive birth rate. If we didn't have immigration, we wouldn't have a positive birth rate, which means that we would have more people dying in the United States than being born in the United States every year. And again, based off of how our society is structured politically and economically, that's potentially concerning. So here's the first thing, right? We're getting older, we're not having as many kids. And as we get older and as we don't have as many kids, the population is also becoming much more diverse. So if we go back to 1960 and we look at kind of how we break out from a racial standpoint, 85% of the US population in 1960 is white, okay? If we move forward to 2020, we don't know exactly where we are right now. That's what the census, do the census, okay, that's what the census is for. But we anticipate that maybe that's going to be 60% white, okay? As we move forward 10, 20 years, whites are no longer the majority of the population, and Hispanics become a huge percentage of the population. And again, why does this matter from a political standpoint? Well, let's look at this racial breakout. Who votes for Republicans? Old white guys, okay? That's the demographic that they're most successful with. When you look at the other racial characteristics, Democrats win all of these other racial groups pretty significant margins, and they're still winning quite a lot of white voters. So as the population becomes more racially diverse, as whites become a less significant part of the population, if the Republican Party doesn't do something to better appeal to these minority voters, they're going to get their butts handed to them in pretty much every election, unless they repress or prevent minorities from participating in voting. That's just math, guys. Like, it really doesn't care what we think about it. That's just math. As the nation becomes more diverse, one political party has set itself as basically the party of minorities. and that's the Democrats. Whether that's right or wrong, I mean, that's kind of the attitude right now. So if Republicans can't better position themselves with policy preferences and ways to appeal to minority voters, they're going to get their butts kicked consistently. And again, that leads to the question, well, are they going to change? I don't know. Like, I honestly don't know. We've had several major party revisions in American history, you know, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the Federalists, Democratic Republicans, the Democrats and the Whigs, and then the Democrats and the Republicans. So maybe a party changes, maybe both parties change. I legitimately don't know. But if nothing else changes, all things being equal, Republicans are going to start to lose a lot of elections. This is an immigration graph, and so this shows what percentage of the population is either first or second generation immigrant. So back in 1900, we're talking maybe 35% of the population is immigrant. Okay, and then we start to see a fairly significant decline, reaching a low point here in the 1980s, which is kind of the height of the Cold War for us. And then we see an uptick that's pretty significant after the end of the Cold War. This chart does not account for the Trump presidency because we actually saw negative immigration, kind of like immigration trends go down for the first time in years after Trump became president. And so I don't know if this trend line is going to recover as far as what percentage of the population becomes immigrants, you know, in 2030 and 2040. But immigration actually started to go up and then started to take a little bit of a drop right here after the Trump administration. The reason that I highlight this, though, is to kind of bring out this fact that America has always historically been a nation of immigrants. We've always had a pretty strong immigrant identity. People emigrate here and then they adopt what it means to be an American. And maybe it takes a generation or two, but it's kind of part of our cultural fabric. Who we are as Americans is heavily informed by the fact that none of us really came from here. Unless you're 100% Native American, your family's an immigrant. And so it's interesting also to note where these immigrants are coming from. So initially it's a lot of European immigration, and then we start to see a lot of Latin American immigration, which again, this is this rise of this Hispanic population as a percent of the total. And so it's, you know, it's going to be interesting over the next 5, 10, 15 years to see how that changes the face of America. There is right now kind of a significant cultural disagreement. Do we have a white America or do we have a diverse America? And Trump and his administration played to the idea that we're a white America. And they won in 2016 based off of appealing to groups that felt more comfortable with that kind of cultural identity. Whether or not that persists, I don't know. There's a couple more things here just talking about how intermarriage between different kinds of races increases pretty significantly over time. What it means to identify as mixed race. So again, some pretty interesting information here. And then we come down here kind of into this age, which I do want to talk a little bit about right now. So as we're talking about these demographic trends, we know that minority or non-white voters prefer Democrats. We know that younger voters prefer Democrats. We know that religiously active people prefer Republicans. We know that educated people prefer Democrats. So knowing all of this information, what does that mean, right? Well, going forward, we have a population that is, as has been noted, more educated, that is more racially diverse, that is less religious. I haven't mentioned that yet, but we are becoming less religious. All of this spells some serious concerns for a party that has strongly identified as an evangelical Christian white male organization, which are the demographic groups that are most strongly self-identified as Republican. And Republicans are losing a lot of support outside of that kind of core demographic population of conservative white male Christians. And that population is becoming smaller and smaller as a percent of the general U.S. population every year that goes by. Okay, so we have a couple more questions in here. Do you know why it is that baby boomers tend to vote Republican? I should revise that. Why white baby boomers tend to vote Republican? Well, Well, I mean, I think there's definitely a variety of factors that inform that particular decision. Again, white baby boomers tend to be the most financially successful and financially stable segments of the population. Um, and those segments of the population have historically had preferences towards the Republican Party because the Republican Party doesn't want to tax you to pay for social services. The Republican Party says, everybody can lift themselves up by their bootstraps and find the financial success they need. And that's a fairly appealing message to people that feel like they've been financially successful. The other thing is, I think when you look at some of these demographic trends relating to race, so white baby boomers, okay, we're going back to 1960, right? So white baby boomers in 1960, they're anywhere from, say, 15, if they're born right after World War II. So at this point, they're, anywhere from like 4 to 16 years old. Their cultural identity is informed by the years that they grew up in. And the United States didn't really start to become, pretty significantly diverse until here about the 1990s to 2010s. And so their whole cultural idea of what America is a white America. A white America that went to church on Sunday or at least believed in God, a white America that had certain ideas of what was, appropriate or inappropriate, um, and that's part of their identity. And the Republican Party is that identity right now, right? So it's the party of white Americans that are religiously active and supports financial success. Like you make money, you get to keep your money, kind of thing. And so a lot of baby boomers demographically find themselves in that group that grew up identifying American as a specific kind of idea. And the Republican Party is definitely the political party that most closely associates with a lot of those cultural norms that they grew up and identified with. I don't think that's the only reason by far. I mean, it's a gross simplification, but we are talking big general trends, and I think that's an important factor to consider. Are there any other countries that have similar change in demographics? How has their politics been affected? Yeah, every country goes through pretty significant demographic changes to one extent or another. There is no country, though, that really is as racially diverse as the United States, and I think that's important to point out. Even other countries that have racially diverse populations, like the United Kingdom, okay, they're nowhere near, or Canada, they are nowhere near as racially diverse as the United States is. If you go to Sweden, everybody's Swedish. Like, you all look the same, you all have the same cousins, you all speak the same language, you've had the same cultural traditions for, 1,000 years. Everybody's the same. When you come to the United States, your next door neighbor could be from Saudi Arabia. Your other next door neighbor could have moved in from Latin America, and across the street could be a couple whose grandparents immigrated here 2 years ago, and down the street from them is somebody that came over on the Mayflower. Like, it's a very, very diverse country. And so the demographic trends that we see in the United States, I think, are far more significant as far as racial diversity than you're going to see anywhere else. As far as this aging population thing, though, yeah, Europe's dealing with it, Japan's dealing with it. Most of the developed nations are dealing with this concern that their populations are getting older. Oh man, now Becky's getting into non-related questions. Becky, we're going to save those for like our econ conversations in the next week or so about pulling people up by bootstraps. One last thing, because we are out of time for today's lecture, that I want to highlight, which is this right here. So, oh no, this is Social Security, right? Because of our aging population, it takes more workers to support the system than it used to. When Social Security first came around, and this chart again shows it, so you had 16 people working for every one person who was on Social Security. In 2010, that was 3 people working for every one person on retirement. which basically means that those 3 workers have to pay in significantly more in order to maintain the system. And if our age demographics continue to flatten out the way they are, the way that Social Security is designed, it's going to be 1-to-1, which means for every person you have on Social Security, you have 1 person that is working a job, which means that 1 person has to pay a huge amount of their resources into making sure that the safety net stays solvent. That's a problem. Like that, again, it's just a math problem. And so you have to figure out how to redesign that system to make it work. Okay, so I apologize. I think I might have actually gone a little bit long on today's lecture, but I appreciate everybody's feedback. I hope you guys all took some time to watch the 2 videos that we sent out. They are, 1, hilarious, and 2, informative. So take a few minutes, watch those. And if you're not in Utah, well, our April Fools for yesterday, Mother Nature decided to go ahead and drop 2 inches of snow on us. It was fantastic. You guys stay safe out there. We will see you guys again next week, and if you need anything, let me know.